He's a friendly local doctor in the small market town of Hyde, England. Well respected, well liked. So when news breaks that Dr. Harold Shipman is accused of murdering 15 of his patients, it sounds crazy.
It's one of the biggest investigations that's ever been conducted by a British police force.
Good morning, gentlemen.
But as he protests his innocence, he becomes the architect of his own demise.
I believe that he intended to be caught.
Could a family doctor turn out to be Britain's worst serial killer ever? October 11th, 1999. It's day one of the trial that will captivate the British. Alleged crimes are all the more shocking because if you can't trust your doctor, who can you trust? The good doctor claims he's done nothing wrong. The story starts in June 1998 when one of Dr. Shipman's patients, 82-year-old Kathleen Grundy, dies unexpectedly. A few days later, her daughter Angela Woodruff receives her mother's will. It's been drawn up by a law firm Angela doesn't recognize.
Angela found it strange because she was actually a solicitor. And as far as she was concerned, her mother's will was safely locked in the vaults of her offices. To start off with, she found it was very poorly put together, something that she couldn't believe her mother would actually do. She was a very particular individual. She still handwrote everything, but this will had been prepared on a typewriter.
Stranger still, the signature on the will doesn't look like Kathleen Grundy's. And it leaves her entire estate to her family doctor, Harold Shipman.
Angela went to see the two witnesses who had signed the will. They didn't know each other, but she discovered that they'd been called into Shipman's surgery, and they were able to say that they'd signed a document. But as far as they were concerned, they didn't think it had been a will.
Angela is concerned by Dr. Shipman's role in what appears to be a blatant attempt to defraud her mother. She also starts to worry that this fraud might be linked to her mother's sudden death. Angela takes her suspicion that her mother may have been murdered to the police. At 3 a.m. on August 1st, 1998, police enter Hyde Cemetery to exhume Kathleen Grundy. When Kathleen Grundy's autopsy results come back, the mystery deepens. It turns out that there was nothing physically wrong with her, and she didn't simply die of old age as Dr. Shipman stated on her death certificate. To find the true cause of death, Detective Inspector Bernard Possels calls in poison experts Julie Evans and Stephen Karch. Dr. Karch is amazed when he starts to look over the results from the poison tests.
I hate to use the word massive for the amount of morphine that she was found in her system, but it was more than sufficient.
Shipman is arrested on September 7, 1998. The next day, he is charged with the murder of Kathleen Grundy. But the plot has only just begun to thicken.
My very first day, I thought, my God, I've met the devil incarnate.
Over the last 20 years, Dr. Harold Shipman has signed hundreds of death certificates, many of them for elderly people who died suddenly. When a lethal dose of morphine is found in one of Shipman's patients, Detective Bernard Postles orders more exhumations. And even Dr. Shipman's loyal patients start to wonder what's going on.
When I was driving to work one day, I saw on the billboards that there'd been another 3 exhumed people, and began to feel a little bit suspicious.
Until now, Peter Wagstaff hasn't questioned Dr. Shipman's innocence. They've known each other for over 20 years. But Dr. Shipman was with Peter's mother, 81-year-old Kathleen, when she died.
We'd obviously been to see him after my mother's death to find out what had actually happened. He'd told myself and my wife that my mother had phoned to say that she wasn't feeling very well, and he called round. He'd knocked on the door, she come to the door, she was looking very grey and sweaty.
Dr. Shipman claims he was so alarmed by Peter's mother's appearance, he immediately called the hospital.
He called an ambulance. He went back downstairs to his car to collect his bag. When he returned, she'd actually died. So he cancelled the ambulance.
Peter is now so suspicious, he decides to double-check Dr. Shipman's story. He makes a call to the ambulance service.
I asked if they had any record of the ambulance being called backwards and forwards to my mother's home, and they had no record. So I then contacted British Telecom for an itemised bill, and when the bill arrived, there was no record either of my mother ringing the surgery or an ambulance being called and cancelled.
So it comes as no surprise to Peter when the police called to say they think his mother was one of Shipman's victims. On February 22, 1999, Dr. Harold Shipman is charged with 6 more murders, including that of Kathleen Wagstaff. The doctor's list of victims now totals 15. They are all women whose death certificates Dr. Shipman signed. But he goes to trial still protesting his innocence. The families of the alleged victims all show up in court. The last time some of them saw Harold Shipman was when they had an appointment with him at his office. On the first day of trial, the shocking list of charges is read to the court.
Shipman was actually charged with 15 murders. 9 of them related to bodies that had been exhumed, and the other 6 related to people where the bodies had actually been cremated. So the first thing to actually prove was that the 9 people who had been exhumed had all died at the hands of Dr. Shipman.
The prosecution begins by casting doubt on Dr. Shipman's death certificates.
There tended to be 2 main causes of death that Shipman showed on the death certificates of his victims. One was that they had died from a heart attack, and the second one that they had died from a stroke.
The autopsy results proved that these conclusions were completely untrue. All of the alleged victims had died from morphine poisoning. The prosecution proposes that Dr. Shipman murdered them with a lethal injection. But Dr. Shipman's defense team counters with an extraordinary claim. During interviews with police, Shipman had told them that his patients, including Kathleen Grundy, had been taking morphine without his knowledge.
I had my suspicions that she was actually abusing a narcotic of some sort. But the scenario was there, and she did have drugs available. She may well have given herself accidentally an overdose.
And so, at the trial, the defense team shocks the court by repeating the allegation that Kathleen Grundy was a drug addict. As proof, they refer to entries Dr. Shipman made in her medical records.
Kathleen Grundy was an 81-year-old woman, a pillar of the community, ex-mayoress of Hyde, been a company secretary in her time, and it seemed ridiculous that he would suggest that. But to explore that possibility, we decided to have her hair examined by an expert.
If Kathleen Grundy took morphine regularly, it would have been incorporated into her hair as it grew.
You take hair specimen and then you wash it and keep track of what keeps coming off on the wash solution. Then you basically dissolve it. What's called liquid extraction. You can extract any drugs out of the solution that the hair is dissolved in and run it through a measuring machine.
The prosecution presents the results from the drug test.
Well, it showed no morphine. That's the whole point.
Dr. Shipman's morphine addict defense collapses. The evidence is damning, but Dr. Shipman has not yet had a chance to defend himself. That changes on day 47 of the trial.
Harold Shipman coped with the cross-examination fairly well, and he was going to give as good as he got.
Despite the damning evidence against him, Dr. Harold Shipman takes the stand with brazen confidence.
He saw that he was going toe-to-toe with the prosecuting barrister, and he was going to give as good as he got.
Dr. Shipman is on the stand for a grueling 2.5 days. He never wavers from his assertion that he is not guilty.
Harold Shipman's defense was I didn't do it.
But under cross-examination, he is unable to account for the strange coincidence that he had visited all of the victims on the day they died.
He was unable to actually explain away the fact that many of these people had died within an hour or two of him attending to them. He was unable to explain, for instance, why Ivy Lomas had died in his presence, in his surgery, when he was the only one that was actually there. So he didn't really, in essence, have any defense to these murders.
Finally, on the third day of cross-examination, the prosecution manages to rattle him.
During the course of the trial, Harold Shipman was asked about a particular list of people, and it was actually an extract from one of the morphine registers from one of the pharmacies.
The prosecution produces a list of 12 names, none of whom are the alleged victims of Shipman, but all of them had been prescribed one 30-milligram dose of morphine. 30 milligrams can kill 6 adult men.
There was diamorphine prescribed by Harold Shipman through the pharmacy next door to him, which was 5 and 6 times the amount that was prescribed by all the other pharmacies in Hyde.
As the prosecution goes through the patients on the list, a strange pattern starts to emerge.
There were 2 or 3 people that gave evidence at the trial from that list. I seem to remember that one of them was a retired policeman, and he was able to give evidence that he'd never received morphine and couldn't understand why he appeared on that list as having been prescribed it.
On the stand, Dr. Shipman cannot explain why healthy patients were prescribed lethal doses of morphine.
Some of those people, curiously, had actually died 2 or 3 days before these prescriptions had been written.
The prosecution alleges Dr. Shipman collected the prescriptions himself to stockpile the drug for his future murders. Shipman's secret stash of morphine is a smoking gun. On January 25, 2000, the jury is sent out to deliberate.
I suppose the most emotional part was when all the evidence had been given, the jury had gone out. Then there was probably a wait of a week, and everybody was very emotionally strained. They were very tense. That was a very difficult period, really.
The jury were out deliberating on their verdict for 6 days, which is fairly unusual. However, when you consider the amount of evidence that they were having to evaluate in the deliberations, then it's perhaps understandable.
On January 31st, the families of all the alleged victims arrive in court to hear the verdict. The foreman announces that Dr. Shipman is guilty of forging Kathleen Grundy's will and 15 murders.
The verdict was unanimous on all 16 counts.
For the families, it's vindication.
The result is the right result. It was the only result that could possibly have been. My mother trusted Dr. Shipman. He cynically and callously betrayed that trust.
In his closing remarks, Judge Forbes proclaims that Harold Shipman committed the ultimate betrayal. He sentences him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The 15 families of the victims believe their ordeal is finally over. But as for the sinister deeds of Dr. Shipman, investigators would learn they had only scratched the surface. The British government sets up a public inquiry to investigate whether Dr. Harold Shipman has killed any more of his patients. Its conclusions are horrifying.
Between 1977 and 1991, Shipman killed 71 patients. In the last 6 years before his arrest, while working as a sole practitioner at the Market Street Surgery in Hyde, he killed 143. Of the 215 known victims, 171 were women and 44 were men.
That means in 1998, the year Dr. Shipman was arrested, he was averaging 1 murder every 10 days. The astonishing number of victims makes Harold Shipman one of the world's most prolific serial killers.
Good morning, gentlemen.
But what is perhaps most astounding about the case is that he may have continued to kill unchecked had it not been for the inept and obvious forgery of Kathleen Grundy's will.
When you look at the will, it's such a cack-handed forgery that you can't understand how he expected Kathleen Grundy's family to be fooled by such a poor forgery.
Dr. Shipman was an intelligent man. Was he the architect of his own demise?
I do believe that he wanted to get caught. If you can kill as many people as he did, you don't make silly mistakes.
Shipman had been committing the perfect murders for over 20 years.
I've been advised to stand and let you take a photograph.
Some suggest he wanted his grisly achievement to be recognized.
There is a theory that it's pointless being the most prolific serial killer that the world has ever known, if in actual fact nobody knows about it and you've not been caught.
There was still a great question left unanswered in the Shipman case. Why did he murder so many people?
The first two things that come through your mind are money and sex. And that's clearly not the case in any of these cases.
The prosecution claimed Dr. Shipman found killing to his taste. And that may be as close to the truth as it's possible to get.
I had hoped that just one day he'd call a press conference and say, right, this is why I did it. Because we really, to this day, don't know.
On January 13th, 2004, 4 years into his sentence, Dr. Shipman is found hanging in his cell in Wakefield High Security Prison. He had said he'd kill himself before he was 60, so his wife Primrose would get his full pension.
Primrose and the children would be provided for. And he was as good as his word.
In the end, Dr. Harold Shipman's own death was as cold and calculated as his murders.